Rude white hotel worker turns away Latina billionaire. She returns the next day as the owner. The air was thick with tension as Marisol Delgado, one of the richest women in the world, stepped into the lobby of the lavish five-star hotel in downtown Manhattan. With her impeccable designer suit and the faint shimmer of diamonds around her neck, she exuded an air of quiet confidence. Her dark brown eyes swept across the elegant space, but there was no mistaking the look on her face. She had arrived with a plan, and it would unfold in a way that no one could have predicted. "Excuse me, miss," Marisol spoke to the front desk worker, her voice calm but with a hint of firmness. "I have a reservation under Marisol Delgado." The young woman behind the counter barely looked up from her phone, a bored expression on her face. "Do you have ID?" she asked, barely hiding the annoyance in her voice. Marisol blinked. She wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially when she had already given her name. "Yes, I do," she replied, reaching into her bag to pull out her driver's license. The young woman glanced at the ID, then scoffed. "Delgado. You're not staying here." She tossed the ID back at Marisol as if it were nothing more than a piece of trash. "We don't serve people like you." Marisol's brow furrowed in confusion. The woman's tone was rude, dismissive, and something else, something that felt personal. Her mind raced, but she managed to keep her composure. "Excuse me?" Marisol asked, her voice quieter now, but there was an edge to it that made the young woman hesitate. "You don't know who I am." The woman smirked. "Yeah, I do. You're just some Latina trying to get a room in a fancy hotel. This is a five-star place, not a cheap motel." For a moment, Marisol felt the sting of her words. But she wasn't about to let this rude, arrogant worker ruin her day. She knew how to handle situations like this. With a calm smile, she stood straighter, her posture strong and unyielding. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Marisol said, her voice smooth, "but I'll be back tomorrow. And you'll remember me. Don't worry." The young woman laughed, shaking her head. "Yeah, right. Go ahead and try. You won't get far." Marisol turned on her heel and left the hotel, her mind swirling with the insult. But she didn't let anger take over. She had a plan, and she wasn't about to let some rude hotel worker stand in her way. The next day, Marisol walked back into the same hotel. This time, however, she didn't walk in as a guest. She walked in as the new owner. She had bought the hotel overnight, and now with a single phone call, everything had changed. She approached the front desk, where the same young woman stood, her eyes wide as she noticed Marisol approaching. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the young woman asked, her voice trembling. Marisol smiled, a knowing smile. "Yes, you can. I'm the new owner of this hotel. And I believe you've met my assistant already." Before the woman could say another word, the general manager stepped forward. His face turned white as he realized what was happening. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice faltering. Marisol glanced at him and then at the worker, who now looked terrified. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just here to make sure everything is running smoothly." The young woman looked like she might faint. You're the owner," she stammered. Marisol didn't respond immediately. She simply walked past the counter, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The woman was too stunned to move, too shocked to even apologize. Marisol didn't care. Her focus was on something much bigger. As she made her way to the elevator, she couldn't help but smirk. This was just the beginning. This rude hotel worker had no idea what was coming next. And that was just one of the many people who would soon feel the power of Marisol's influence. But there was something else on her mind, a much bigger plan. One that would change the course of the hotel's future forever. She had some important meetings lined up for the day, and nothing would stop her now. It hadn't been long since that fateful encounter, but Marisol's actions were about to set the city buzzing. No one could have predicted the storm that was coming. It wasn't just the hotel that would fall under her control, it was the entire city of Manhattan, and beyond. But before she could continue with her plans, another obstacle loomed, one that threatened to shake her resolve. She had no idea just how deep this issue would go. It was only a matter of time before her next challenge arose. Would she conquer this too, or would it bring her down? It all started a year ago, when Marisol had been just another successful businesswoman in Silicon Valley, rising up the ranks with her tech company. She had already made millions, but she craved more. She wanted to leave a legacy, something permanent, something that would make her name unforgettable. So she began to branch out into real estate, starting with small properties. But as her success grew, so did her ambition. When she set her sights on something bigger, nothing would stop her. Her eyes eventually fell on the luxury hotel in the heart of Manhattan. The one with the shiny gold letters on the front that spelled out the Royal Palace. It was the perfect acquisition. With its prime location, reputation, and high-class clientele, Marisol knew she could turn it into something even more extraordinary. But she never expected that the hotel staff would be so dismissive. She certainly never imagined a worker would turn her away, just because of her background. And yet, it happened. It stung more than she wanted to admit, but it also ignited something inside her, a fire that burned hotter and brighter. She knew then that nothing would stop her from making her mark on the world, not even the petty racist attitudes of a few people. They would soon see what she was capable of. But Marisol had no idea just how far this would go. She hadn't expected that turning away from that hotel would only be the beginning. The story was about to take a turn she didn't see coming. One that would shake everything she had worked for. As she boarded the elevator to her suite that night, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her lawyer. The message was simple: "I think you should take a look at this." Marisol's heart skipped a beat as she read the attached file. It wasn't just any business document. It was a warning. A warning that someone was watching her closely. Someone who had been waiting for her to make a move. She didn't have time to dwell on it. She had more pressing matters to attend to. But one thing was certain. The coming days would be a test of her strength and resolve. And she wasn't about to back down. Marisol stared at her phone, the message from her lawyer still fresh in her mind. The warning wasn't just some trivial concern, it was a direct threat. She set her phone down on the polished wooden desk in the corner of her hotel suite and leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the armrest. Whoever had sent this warning was clearly no amateur. They knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. But what they didn't know was that Marisol was always one step ahead. She had built her empire from the ground up, and she had dealt with threats like this before. It didn't matter who was trying to bring her down. She had always found a way to outsmart them. And this time would be no different. She glanced over at the clock on the wall. It was getting late, but she had no intention of sleeping. Not when there was so much at stake. She picked up her phone again and typed a quick message to her lawyer. "Find out who's behind this. I need answers. Fast." She hit send and then turned her attention to the other matters at hand. The Royal Palace was hers now, and she had big plans for it. But before she could move forward, there were a few loose ends to tie up. One of those ends was the rude hotel worker who had turned her away. Marisol hadn't forgotten about her, and she knew that her return to the hotel as its owner would have consequences. The young woman would have to answer for what she had done. The next morning, Marisol walked into the hotel with a new sense of purpose. She was ready to take control, not just of the property but of every person in it. As she entered the lobby, she was greeted by the familiar face of the general manager, who immediately came over to her. "Good morning, Ms. Delgado," he said, his voice respectful, but there was an unease in his eyes. He knew what had happened the day before, and he probably wasn't looking forward to what was coming. "Good morning," Marisol replied, her tone cool but professional. "I need to speak with your front desk staff." The manager hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. I'll gather them for you." Within minutes, the young woman who had turned Marisol away the day before was standing in front of her. The look of fear in her eyes was impossible to miss. She had clearly been warned about what would happen next, and she was doing her best to keep her composure. "Do you remember me?" Marisol asked, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. The young woman's mouth opened and closed, as though she couldn't quite find the words. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean." "No, you didn't," Marisol interrupted. "But you did mean something. You meant to make a judgment about me based on nothing but my appearance and my background. That's a mistake I'm not going to forget." The young woman's face flushed with embarrassment, but she still didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. She began again, but Marisol raised a hand to silence her. "I don't need your excuses," Marisol said coldly. "You will remain employed here for now, but understand this. If I ever hear that you've treated another guest with such disrespect, I will not hesitate to have you removed. This is a hotel of luxury, of class, and of respect for all people. If you can't uphold that, then you have no place here." The young woman nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." Marisol turned away from her and addressed the general manager. "I expect this to be the last time anything like this happens. Do I make myself clear? The manager swallowed, then nodded. Crystal clear, Ms. Delgado. As Marisol walked away, she felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge, it was about setting things right. She had built her success on integrity and respect, and she wouldn't let anyone tarnish that. But as she made her way to the elevator, something else weighed heavily on her mind: the message from her lawyer. The threat had shaken her confidence more than she was willing to admit, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized she needed to find out who was behind it. That afternoon, she sat in her office, her laptop open in front of her, as she combed through the financial records of the hotel. She needed to know if anyone had been trying to sabotage her, to find out if there were any hints about who might be involved. But just as she was getting deep into the numbers, her phone rang. It was her lawyer. "Marisol," the lawyer said, his voice tense. "I've got the information you asked for. You're not going to like it." She leaned forward, a chill running down her spine. "Who's behind the threat?" "Someone you know," he replied. "It's Edward Cross." Marisol felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. Edward Cross was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, and he had been one of her business rivals for years. She had never seen him as a threat, until now. "Edward Cross." Marisol repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does he want?" The lawyer hesitated. "He's been watching your every move, Marisol. He's not happy about you buying the royal palace. In fact, he's been planning to take it from you. And I don't think he's going to stop until he does." Marisol's mind raced. Edward Cross was a dangerous man, and he was playing a game she wasn't sure she was ready for. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let him take what was hers. Not without a fight. "I need to meet with him," Marisol said firmly, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. "Set it up." Her lawyer hesitated for a moment before replying. "Are you sure? He's not someone you want to cross." "I'm sure," Marisol said. "This ends now." As she hung up the phone, she felt the weight of what was coming. The battle for the royal palace had just begun, and she was going to make sure she came out on top. Marisol stared at the phone for a moment longer, her thoughts swirling. Edward Cross. The name was familiar, too familiar. For years, she had competed against him in the business world, never expecting it would come to this. He had always been a powerful figure, one of the few people who could rival her own success. But she had never thought he would resort to threats to get what he wanted. Still, there was no time to waste. She couldn't afford to back down now. The royal palace was hers, and no one, not even someone like Edward Cross, was going to take it from her. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to get here. There was no turning back. Marisol made a quick call to her assistant, instructing her to set up a meeting with Cross as soon as possible. She didn't want to waste any more time. Every minute counted. The next day, she found herself sitting in a sleek, modern conference room on the top floor of one of Edward Cross's many skyscrapers in the heart of New York City. The view from the window was breathtaking, but Marisol barely noticed. She was too focused on what was about to happen. The door opened, and in walked Edward Cross. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and an air of confidence that could rival anyone. His gray suit fit him perfectly, and his eyes, cold, calculating, locked onto Marisol as he stepped into the room. He didn't offer a handshake or even a smile. Instead, he took a seat across from her, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me," he said, his voice low and smooth, like liquid velvet. Marisol didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're doing, Edward. You think you can intimidate me, threaten me, and force me to give up the royal palace. But you're wrong." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Is that so? And what makes you so sure of yourself, Marisol? You're just a woman with a little money and some influence. Do you really think you can compete with me?" Marisol leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his. "I don't need to compete with you, Edward. I'm not interested in playing your game. I just want what's mine. The royal palace. And I'm not giving it up." He chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. "You think you can just walk in here and talk to me like that? You have no idea what you're up against." Marisol's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. There was something about Edward Cross that made her feel uneasy, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But she wasn't going to let him see her weakness. "I know exactly what I'm up against," she said, her voice steady. You're used to getting what you want by force, by intimidation. But I'm not going to let you bully me. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an almost amused expression. You really think you can take me down? You think you can outsmart me, outplay me? Marisol met his gaze without flinching. I don't need to outsmart you. I just need to make sure you understand that I'm not someone you can push around. Edward's smile faded, and for a moment, he looked almost thoughtful. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened again. I don't make threats lightly, Marisol. And I don't take kindly to people who get in my way. You think you're untouchable because you have money and power? I've been doing this a lot longer than you. Marisol's eyes narrowed. If you think I'm just going to fold under pressure, then you don't know me very well. I've dealt with people like you before. And they've all fallen. There was a long silence as the two of them locked eyes, neither one willing to break. Finally, Edward spoke again, his voice cold. You think you're in control here, but you're not. I own this city, Marisol. I built it. And I don't share. You'll either fall in line, or you'll be left behind. For the first time, Marisol felt a flicker of doubt. Was this it? Was this how it ended? She had made it this far, but now, facing the full force of Edward's power, the thought of losing it all made her stomach turn. But she wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. I don't think so, Edward, she said, her voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. And if you think you can scare me off, you're sorely mistaken. He didn't say anything for a long moment, but when he finally spoke, his tone was different. There was a hint of respect, a grudging acknowledgement of her resolve. We'll see how long your confidence lasts, he said. But don't say I didn't warn you. With that, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Marisol to sit alone with her thoughts. Her heart was still racing, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had just had her first face-to-face confrontation with Edward Cross, and it had been a lot more intense than she had anticipated. She wasn't sure if she had won or lost, but one thing was clear, this was far from over. As she sat there, trying to calm herself, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from her lawyer. The hotel's security system has been compromised. Someone's trying to hack into the surveillance footage. Marisol's stomach dropped. This was bad. This was very bad. Before she could respond, her phone rang again. It was her assistant. Ms. Delgado, you need to come down to the lobby right away. There's been an incident. Her heart skipped a beat. What now? She had a feeling this was just the beginning. Tell me what happened, Marisol demanded, already heading toward the elevator. We don't know all the details yet, but one of the staff members is missing. And there's something strange going on with the security footage. Marisol's mind raced. This couldn't be a coincidence. Whoever was behind this, they were making their move. And they were playing a much bigger game than she had ever realized. She stepped into the elevator, her jaw set with determination. She wasn't about to let anyone take what was hers. Not now. Not ever. As the elevator descended, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. And she had no idea how deep this conspiracy went. But one thing was for sure, Edward Cross had just become her biggest enemy. And she was going to make sure he regretted ever underestimating her. The doors opened with a soft chime, and Marisol stepped out into the lobby, ready to face whatever came next. The moment Marisol stepped into the hotel lobby, she felt a sharp tension in the air. The usual hustle and bustle of the high-end establishment had been replaced by a subdued, uneasy silence. Staff members stood in small clusters, whispering to each other in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around. Her assistant, Lucy, was standing near the front desk, looking pale and worried. When she saw Marisol, she rushed over. Ms. Delgado, I don't know what's going on, but this is bad, Lucy said, her voice trembling. We've got a serious situation. Marisol's stomach tightened. What's happened? Where's the staff member? Lucy hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward a side hallway where the staff offices were located. It's one of the housekeepers. No one has seen her for hours. We've checked her room, and there's no sign of her. But the strange part is the footage. Someone tampered with the security system. Marisol's eyes narrowed. The feeling that something much darker was going on settled deeper in her gut. What do you mean, tampered with the footage? Lucy handed her phone to Marisol. On the screen, she saw a distorted video. The timestamp showed late last night, just hours before the incident. In the footage, A figure in a dark hoodie moved through the hotel's corridors, blending into the shadows, and then entering the staff hallway. It was hard to make out much, but it was clear that the figure had been trying to avoid detection. "This doesn't look like anything our staff would do," Lucy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something off about this. It's like someone's deliberately trying to cover their tracks." Marisol's mind was racing. The housekeeper, she remembered, was one of the long-time employees who had always been reliable. She had no reason to believe she'd simply disappeared without a trace. And the tampering with the footage, it was too deliberate. Too orchestrated. "Get the security team to check the rest of the footage," Marisol ordered. "And find out where she is. I want a full report within the hour." As Lucy hurried off, Marisol felt a cold chill run down her spine. The message from her lawyer about the compromised system flashed in her mind again. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing with the hotel, they were playing with her. With no time to waste, Marisol moved swiftly toward the back office, where the hotel's management team typically gathered. The general manager, Tom Sullivan, was waiting for her, a look of concern etched on his face. He stood up as soon as she entered, and without wasting a second, he began speaking. "I've just received some unsettling news, Ms. Delgado," Tom said. "It appears that several of our top-tier employees have been quietly leaving the hotel, some of them without even informing us. I'm afraid we may be dealing with an inside job." Marisol froze. An inside job? Her thoughts immediately went back to Edward Cross. Could he have somehow orchestrated this? Had he used his influence to turn the staff against her? Is there a way to trace who might be involved? Marisol asked, her tone sharp. Tom nodded. "We've already reached out to our security team to check the access logs, but the compromised footage is complicating things. It's like someone's trying to erase any evidence of what's happening behind the scenes." Marisol's eyes darkened. This was no longer just about the hotel. It was about everything she had worked for. If she was going to keep her grip on the royal palace, she needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast. She paused for a moment, running her fingers through her hair, trying to piece everything together. The missing housekeeper. The tampered footage. The employees leaving without a word. And the one constant throughout it all, Edward Cross. "This isn't just a coincidence," Marisol muttered under her breath. "Someone's playing me. And I have a feeling I know who it is." Tom looked at her, confusion flashing across his face. "Edward Cross." Marisol nodded, her jaw tightening. "He's behind this. I can feel it." The general manager's expression shifted to one of concern. "But Ms. Delgado, what if he's already got more power in this hotel than we realize?" Marisol met his gaze. "Then we fight. We don't back down." Tom looked hesitant, but he didn't argue. "I'll make sure the team continues to investigate. But we may need to prepare for something bigger than we're expecting." Marisol took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. She had been through a lot in her life, more than most people could imagine, but this felt different. She was fighting not just for her business, but for her reputation. "I want the hotel completely secure. No one leaves, no one enters without clearance. We're locking everything down." Tom nodded, his face grim. "Understood. I'll have the team start immediately." Before Marisol could turn to leave, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her lawyer. "We've located more tampered footage. It's worse than we thought. Someone's been deleting key files." Marisol's heart sank. It wasn't just the hotel staff that had been compromised. Whoever was behind this had taken great pains to cover their tracks. The stakes were rising, and every minute was critical. But there was something else gnawing at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. Edward Cross had been quiet for the past few days, but now, it seemed as if he had set a trap, and she had walked right into it. She turned to the general manager, determination written on her face. "I need to meet with the head of security. Now." As she made her way to the security office, she couldn't help but wonder just how deep this conspiracy ran. She had taken control of the royal palace, but now, it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping away, one dark secret at a time. In the back of her mind, the looming question remained: could she stop Edward Cross before it was too late? Or had she already walked into a game where the odds were stacked against her? The moment she entered the security office, she was met by the head of security, Rick Dawson, a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude. He stood up immediately, his face tense. "Ms. Delgado, I've got something you need to see," Rick said, his voice low. He gestured toward a bank of monitors where several security feeds were being displayed. As Marisol stepped closer, she noticed something chilling, a shadowy figure, moving silently through the hotel's back corridors. The timestamp on the screen showed the footage from just a few hours ago. The figure was unmistakably the same one from the footage earlier. Someone had been inside the hotel, tampering with more than just the security system. Rick paused the footage, looking up at Marisol. "There's more. We traced the figure's movements. They were heading toward your office." Her heart skipped a beat. "I'll be damned if I let this go on any longer," Marisol said, her voice tight with resolve. "Find out who this is. And make sure they don't get away." The wheels were in motion now. It was a fight for survival, one that would test everything she had built, every ounce of power she had earned. But Marisol was ready. She had no intention of losing. Not now. Not ever. Marisol stood motionless in the security office, her eyes glued to the screen. The figure in the footage was moving with purpose, seemingly unaware that their every move was being tracked. The timestamp flashed again, confirming that the intruder had been inside the hotel just a few hours ago. They had managed to slip past security and sabotage the hotel surveillance systems with ease. Her heart raced as she watched the figure's shadowy form slink down the corridor toward her office. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where they needed to go. Marisol's pulse quickened with a mixture of dread and determination. This was no random act of vandalism, it was an attack, a direct hit on everything she had worked for. And she knew exactly who was pulling the strings. Edward Cross had already shown his hand. He was playing a dangerous game, and it seemed he was willing to go to any lengths to undermine her. Marisol wasn't about to let him win. "Rick, I need a list of all the staff members who have access to the back hallways and the security feeds," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I want names, positions, everything. Now." Rick nodded quickly, moving to a nearby desk where a file cabinet stood. As he pulled out a drawer and began rifling through it, Marisol's thoughts raced. The missing housekeeper, the tampered footage, the strange behavior of her staff, all of it pointed to the same thing. There was a mole in the hotel, someone on the inside working against her. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a random act of sabotage. This was part of a bigger, more calculated plan. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her lawyer. "Edward Cross is moving quickly. He's starting to make offers on your other properties. He's trying to buy you out from under your feet. We need to act fast." Marisol clenched her jaw. She had known that Cross wouldn't sit idle, but this? This was more aggressive than she had anticipated. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was trying to break her. And she couldn't let him succeed. Rick returned to her side, a folder of names in hand. "Here's the list, Ms. Delgado. These are the staff members who've had direct access to the security systems and the restricted areas." Marisol skimmed the list, her eyes scanning the names quickly. One name stood out to her, a security officer named Daniel Hayes. He had worked at the hotel for years, never raising any suspicion. But now, seeing his name on this list, a cold feeling washed over her. "I want you to pull up every interaction Daniel Hayes has had with the security footage," she ordered. "If he's involved in this, I need to know now." Rick nodded and immediately started working on the system. As he typed in the commands, Marisol's mind raced again. Could Daniel be the mole? It seemed too easy, too obvious. But at this point, nothing was off the table. The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the clicking of keys and the soft hum of the security system. After a few moments, Rick's voice broke through. "Ms. Delgado, I'm pulling up his access logs now. There's something strange here. It looks like Daniel was the one who deleted the footage from last night. He had full control over it." Marisol's heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. She had known it, deep down, but now it was confirmed. Daniel Hayes was the traitor, the one who had been feeding information to Edward Cross. "Where is he now?" Marisol demanded. Rick checked the screen, his expression hardening. "He left the hotel about an hour ago. According to the access logs, he hasn't returned yet." Marisol's eyes narrowed. "We need to find him. Now." She turned sharply, heading for the door. As she strode down the hallway toward the elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every second that passed brought her closer to losing everything. The elevator doors opened, and Marisol stepped inside. Her thoughts swirled with 1,000 different possibilities, all of them grim. She couldn't let Cross get the better of her. She couldn't let him win. But as the elevator descended to the parking garage, a sinking feeling settled in her gut. The stakes had just been raised. This wasn't just about the hotel anymore. This was personal. When the elevator doors opened, she was met by Lucy, who was waiting for her in the garage. The assistant's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Ms. Delgado, you need to see this," Lucy said, holding out her phone. Marisol took the phone, her eyes scanning the screen. The message was from an unknown number. "We know where you are. And we're watching. Cross is going to take it all from you. Your hotel. Your reputation. Your life." The message was clear. The threat was real. But it wasn't just Cross she had to worry about anymore. Whoever had sent this message was part of something bigger. And that was the scariest part of all. "Get the car," Marisol ordered, her voice low. "We're going to find Daniel Hayes." Lucy didn't hesitate. Within moments, they were in the car, driving through the dark streets of Manhattan. The weight of the situation hung heavily over Marisol, but she knew she couldn't afford to back down now. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an alert from the hotel's security system. A new message flashed on the screen. "Daniel Hayes has been located. He's at the old warehouse on the docks. We've got eyes on him." Marisol's eyes narrowed. This was it. This was the confrontation she had been dreading. But it was also the moment she had been waiting for. "We're going to the docks," she said, her voice cold with determination. "This ends tonight." The drive felt endless, every turn and every stoplight heightening the tension. As they neared the docks, the familiar industrial landscape came into view, dark and foreboding. It was the perfect place for a confrontation, a place where things could disappear without a trace. Lucy parked the car a few blocks away, and they walked the rest of the way, staying in the shadows. Marisol's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of what was about to happen. This was the moment when everything would come to a head. Would she take down Daniel and Cross, or would she lose everything? They approached the warehouse cautiously, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps on the cracked pavement. Marisol could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. As they reached the entrance of the warehouse, Marisol paused, signaling to Lucy to wait. She knew this had to be done carefully. The element of surprise was her only advantage. She pushed open the door slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. And there, in the dim light of the warehouse, stood Daniel Hayes, looking back at her with a mixture of fear and defiance in his eyes. "So you finally found me," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I knew it was only a matter of time." Marisol's eyes locked onto his, her voice steady but fierce. "You've made a mistake, Daniel. And now you're going to pay for it." Before he could respond, there was a sudden sound, a sharp noise from the back of the warehouse. Marisol's eyes snapped to the sound, and in that instant, everything changed. A new figure emerged from the shadows, one Marisol hadn't expected. Edward Cross. "Ms. Delgado," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "I knew you'd come for him. But I didn't think you'd be this predictable." Marisol's stomach dropped. She had walked right into his trap. The real battle had just begun. Marisol's breath caught in her throat as Edward Cross stepped into the dim light of the warehouse, his cold eyes locking onto hers. The very last person she had expected to find here was standing in front of her, a smug smile playing at the corners of his lips. Daniel Hayes, the traitor, was still standing just a few feet away, his hands nervously shifting in his pockets. It was clear now that he was nothing more than a pawn in Cross's game, but Marisol's attention was fixed entirely on Cross. He was the one who had orchestrated everything, the sabotage, the threats, the manipulation of her staff. And now, here he was, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "I must admit, Marisol," Cross said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm impressed. You've managed to get this far, even with all the obstacles in your way. But it's all over now. You're out of your depth." Marisol didn't flinch. She had faced threats before, none of them as dangerous as this, but she had learned to keep her composure. She wasn't about to let Edward Cross see her fear. "You thought I'd back down, didn't you?" Marisol replied, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. "You thought you could bully me into giving up what's mine. But I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." Cross chuckled darkly, taking a step forward. "You've already lost, Marisol. I own this city and you," he paused, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You're nothing but a small player who's outlived her usefulness." Daniel, standing awkwardly to the side, shot a nervous glance at Cross before speaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just following orders. Marisol's eyes narrowed. You betrayed me, Daniel. You thought Cross would protect you, but you were wrong. Edward smiled, his gaze never leaving Marisol. He's just one of many who will fall by the wayside, Marisol. Do you really think you can stop me? For a moment, Marisol felt the weight of his words. He was powerful, dangerously so. But in that instant, something inside her clicked. She wasn't just going to let him win. She couldn't. You're wrong, she said, her voice firm, a new fire burning in her chest. You underestimate me, Edward. And that's your biggest mistake. With a swift motion, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. It was a tracker she had planted on Daniel's phone when she first suspected his involvement. It had been active the entire time, feeding information back to her in real time. She had known exactly where they were, and now she was ready to play her hand. You think you're in control, she said, turning the device toward him. But you're not. I've already alerted the police. They'll be here any minute. Cross's face darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. You think the authorities will help you? You're nothing more than a pawn in a game you don't understand. For a moment, it looked like he was about to make a move, but then something unexpected happened. Daniel stepped forward, his hands trembling as he raised them in a gesture of surrender. Edward, please, he pleaded. I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't know how to get out. Cross's eyes flicked toward Daniel, and for a split second, Marisol saw something in his gaze. Something dark, something dangerous. But then it was gone, replaced by the calculated coldness she had come to expect from him. Daniel, you're weak, Cross spat. You're nothing. You never were. And now, you've outlived your usefulness. Before Marisol could react, Cross turned and motioned to the shadows behind him. Two more figures emerged, their faces hidden under hoods. They were both armed. Marisol's heart skipped a beat. She had expected Cross to fight dirty, but this was more than she had anticipated. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he was willing to escalate things to a point where lives were at risk. You should have stayed out of my way, Marisol, Cross said, his voice dripping with venom. But now, you've made this personal. Marisol took a deep breath. This was it. There was no more room for hesitation. She couldn't back down, not now. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for everything she had worked for. Her eyes locked onto the two armed figures as they advanced, their footsteps echoing in the vast empty warehouse. She knew she had only a split second to make her move. In one swift motion, Marisol pressed a button on the device in her hand. A loud, high-pitched sound filled the air, followed by the unmistakable screech of a door opening. The sound was coming from the back of the warehouse, where the police had been waiting for her signal. The door swung open just as the armed men reached her, and officers rushed in, guns drawn. Drop the weapons. Now, one of the officers shouted. The two figures hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden intervention. But before they could react, a shot rang out, followed by the sound of struggling. Marisol couldn't see everything that was happening, but the chaos that ensued told her that the police had taken control. Edward Cross looked at the officers, his face twisted in rage. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything from me, he snarled, his fists clenched at his sides. Marisol stepped back, her heart still pounding, but now with a sense of relief. The situation wasn't over yet, but it was no longer as hopeless as it had seemed moments before. The police had him surrounded. You're finished, Cross, she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Your game is up. Cross sneered at her, his anger palpable. This isn't over, Marisol. I'm just getting started. But before he could say anything else, one of the officers moved in quickly, restraining him and slapping handcuffs on his wrists. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted assault, the officer said, his voice calm but firm. You have the right to remain silent. Marisol watched as Cross was led away, the smugness gone from his face. He had underestimated her, and now, he was paying the price. She had won. For now. But as she stood in the warehouse, the weight of the situation still pressing down on her, Marisol couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Cross wasn't the only player in this game, and she had a long road ahead of her. There were more challenges to come. More battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, Marisol felt a sense of hope. She had fought back, and she had come out on top. Edward Cross may have thought he was invincible, but she had proven that no one was untouchable, not even him. The night was far from over. But for now, Marisol was ready to face whatever came next. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as Marisol stood in the warehouse, still processing what had just happened. Edward Cross, the man who had been an insurmountable threat for so long, was now in custody. She had beaten him at his own game, but the weight of the victory felt oddly heavy. It wasn't just about defeating Cross, it was about everything that had led to this moment, the betrayal, the threats, and the toll it had taken on her. The officers continued to secure the area, leading the two armed men away, their hands bound behind their backs. Daniel Hayes, the former security officer who had played a pivotal role in this mess, stood off to the side, looking utterly defeated. Marisol couldn't help but feel a bit of sympathy for him, despite his role in the conspiracy. He was just another pawn in a much larger game. As one of the officers approached her, she straightened, meeting his gaze. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked, her voice cool. "Cross?" the officer asked, confirming her question. "He'll be processed and charged, Ms. Delgado. Don't worry, we've got him. But we'll need a formal statement from you before we can close the case." Marisol nodded, her mind already shifting into business mode. "I'll cooperate fully. But I want the truth out. I don't want anyone thinking this was a simple case of a disgruntled employee or a random incident. Cross had a plan, and I want people to know just how far he was willing to go." The officer gave a nod of understanding. "We'll make sure the investigation is thorough. You've got nothing to worry about from here." Marisol didn't respond right away. She was grateful for the police's intervention, but she knew this wasn't over. Cross may have been arrested, but the damage had already been done. The threat to her reputation, to her empire, had been real. And though she had fought back, the aftermath would take time to repair. As the officers finished processing Cross and his men, Marisol turned to Lucy, who had been quietly standing nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. "Get the press team on it," Marisol ordered. "We're issuing a statement tomorrow. I want the world to know that I've taken control of the situation. And I want to make sure Cross's criminal activities are exposed for what they were." Lucy nodded, her expression determined. "I'll make sure we get it right, Ms. Delgado. It'll go out first thing in the morning." "Good," Marisol replied. "Make sure it's clear, this isn't just about me. This is about standing up to bullies who think they can control everything. I'm done playing small." Lucy hesitated for a moment, then spoke up, her voice quieter. "You know, this could all go public in a big way, right? This isn't just a corporate battle anymore. Cross's arrest will make waves. Some might see this as a victory for you, but others might think it's a sign of weakness." Marisol gave Lucy a pointed look. "I don't care what people think. I care about what happens next. And right now, I need to make sure this hotel is safe, that my reputation stays intact, and that no one else thinks they can pull a stunt like this again." Lucy nodded, though there was still a trace of concern in her eyes. "Understood, Ms. Delgado. We'll make sure everything is tight." Marisol's eyes flicked toward Daniel, still standing off to the side, his posture hunched in resignation. She had a few questions for him, but for now, she couldn't deal with him. Not yet. There were too many moving pieces, too much still at stake. She turned back to the officers. "I'll head back to the hotel soon. I'll be available for a formal statement in the morning. Just make sure you keep everything under wraps for now. We don't want the press turning this into something bigger than it needs to be." The officer nodded. "Understood, Ms. Delgado. We'll keep you updated." Marisol made her way back to the car, the air still thick with tension. She wasn't sure what had been worse, the threat from Cross or the knowledge that there were still people out there who would stop at nothing to see her fall. Once in the car, Marisol sat in silence for a moment. Her mind raced as she looked out the window at the darkened streets of Manhattan. What she had gone through over the last few days had been overwhelming, but it had also opened her eyes to something much bigger than she had realized: how fragile everything was. Lucy broke the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Marisol let out a deep breath, leaning back in her seat. "I will be. Once this is over." "But is it over?" Lucy pressed gently. "Cross is behind bars, but you know this could make things much worse for you. There's a lot of people who won't forget what he tried to do." Marisol's lips pressed together. "I'm not worried about Cross. I'm worried about what comes next. People like him don't give up. And I can't afford to lower my guard. Lucy didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded and focused on the road ahead, but Marisol could tell she was still processing everything. It wasn't easy to come to terms with the fact that this wasn't a one-off. This was a battle that would continue in various forms. She had no illusions about that. When they arrived back at the hotel, Marisol went straight to her office. It was late, but she needed to make sure everything was in order before she could even think about resting. As she entered the room, her phone buzzed again. Another message. Your next move will determine everything. Cross won't be the last. Trust no one. The words sent a chill through her. Whoever was sending these messages was watching her closely, and they weren't done yet. She opened the message and read it again, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk tightly. Whoever was behind this, whatever force was still lurking in the shadows, wasn't going to let up. They were watching, waiting for her next move. And this time, they weren't going to make it easy. Marisol stood up, her resolve hardening. There was no going back now. She had to finish what she started. She wouldn't let anyone destroy what she had built. She had taken down Cross, but she knew this fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. But tonight, Marisol was preparing for what came next. The weight of the night hung heavy on Marisol as she sat at her desk, staring at the cryptic message on her phone. The ominous words lingered in her mind like a shadow, and for the first time in days, she felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. Whoever was behind the message knew more than they should. They were out there watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And what bothered her more than anything was the fact that she had no idea who it was or what their next move would be. She shoved her phone into her desk drawer, closing it with a decisive click. She needed to focus. There was no time to let fear take hold. Tomorrow, she would hold a press conference to clear her name and put to rest any doubts about the royal palace's future. But that wasn't enough. She needed to root out the deeper threat. She needed to make sure no one else would dare undermine her again. As she stood up from her desk, her mind began to spin with thoughts of what to do next. She couldn't afford to trust anyone completely, not after what had happened with Daniel and Cross. There had to be more players involved, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Lucy knocked softly before entering her office. Ms. Delgado, there's a situation with one of the hotel's upper management. We need to talk. Marisol's thoughts snapped back to the present. What's happened? There's been an internal investigation regarding some of the hotel's finances. One of our senior executives is being accused of falsifying records, Lucy said, her voice strained. It's serious. Marisol felt a cold chill sweep through her. She had suspected there were still problems lurking within the hotel, but this? A financial scandal could be devastating, especially after everything she had just been through. It could ruin her reputation for good. Who's involved? Marisol asked, her voice sharp. It's Eduardo Castillo, the head of finance. He's been with the hotel for years, and as far as I knew, he was one of the most trustworthy people on the team. Marisol felt her chest tighten. Eduardo had been a solid part of her team, and now, it seemed like he had been hiding something. The fact that this scandal was surfacing now, so soon after Cross's downfall, made it feel all the more suspicious. Get me everything you can on Eduardo, Marisol said. I want to know who he's been in contact with, who's been funneling money, and if there's any connection to Cross. Lucy nodded and left the office, leaving Marisol alone again. She stood by the window, looking out over the city as the night stretched on. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. Cross's scheme, the sabotage, the missing housekeeper, Daniel's betrayal, it was all leading her to something bigger. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was no closer to understanding the full scope of what was happening. The next morning came quickly, and Marisol was already at the hotel before the first light of dawn. The press conference was scheduled for noon, but she had a few more details to iron out before she could face the cameras. As she made her way through the back hallways of the hotel, her mind raced. The situation with Eduardo Castillo weighed heavily on her, but she pushed it aside for the moment. She had a bigger task at hand. She needed to control the narrative. The press would be all over her the moment the news broke about Cross's arrest, and she had to make sure it didn't spin out of control. When she reached her office, Lucy was waiting for her with a folder full of information on Eduardo Castillo. Ms. Delgado, Lucy said quietly, I found some disturbing details. Eduardo's been in contact with a company linked to Edward Cross. It looks like he's been funneling money through a series of offshore accounts. We don't know how deep this goes yet, but I think we need to act quickly. Marisol flipped through the pages of the folder, her heart racing as she absorbed the information. Eduardo had been helping Cross fund his operation, or at least facilitating it from the inside. The betrayal hit hard. It wasn't just one person involved anymore, it was a network, a whole system of corruption within the hotel itself. "I'll deal with Eduardo later," Marisol said, her voice cold. "Right now, we need to focus on the press conference. I need to get ahead of this. I can't let the story spiral." Lucy nodded and left to prepare for the conference, leaving Marisol alone to gather her thoughts. She sat at her desk, her fingers tapping the surface absently as she thought about what was coming. She had to be prepared for anything. This press conference would define the public's perception of her, and it could determine whether the hotel and her reputation would survive this crisis. At noon, Marisol stood before the cameras, her heart pounding in her chest as she adjusted the microphone clipped to her jacket. The room was filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as they waited for her to speak. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the pressure building as the room fell silent. "Good afternoon," Marisol began, her voice steady but filled with authority. "I want to address the recent events involving Edward Cross, the Royal Palace Hotel, and the ongoing investigation into certain financial irregularities." She paused for a moment, allowing the room to take in her words before continuing. "Let me be clear, Cross's actions were criminal. He attempted to undermine my business, my reputation, and my employees. I will not tolerate such behavior. I've already taken steps to ensure that the law will hold him accountable." She glanced at the faces in the crowd, watching the reporters scribble down notes. They were listening, but Marisol knew she had to keep their attention. She had to make sure this didn't turn into a media circus that would spiral out of control. "I've also been made aware of the actions of some of my staff members, including Eduardo Castillo, the head of finance," Marisol continued. "Let me assure you that I am fully committed to investigating these matters thoroughly. Any wrongdoing will be addressed, and the individuals responsible will be held accountable." The room was filled with murmurs as the reporters exchanged looks. The mention of Eduardo Castillo's name was bound to stir up questions, and Marisol was ready. She had anticipated it. "Are you saying you had no knowledge of Castillo's involvement?" one reporter asked, raising his hand. Marisol took a deep breath. "At this time, we're still gathering all the facts. But I want to make it clear, I will not allow anyone, not even the people I trust most, to undermine what we've built here. This hotel represents excellence, integrity, and respect for every person who walks through its doors. And if anyone has acted against those values, they will be held accountable." The questions continued, each one more probing than the last, but Marisol held her ground. She knew she couldn't afford to waver. This was her moment to show that she was in control, that she wasn't just some businesswoman at the mercy of the powerful. As the press conference wrapped up, Marisol felt a small sense of relief. She had survived it, and now, it was time to shift her focus to the next step. Cross was behind bars, but that didn't mean the danger was over. Eduardo Castillo was still out there, and she couldn't let him slip through her fingers. As Marisol made her way back to her office, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, her stomach tightening. Another message. "We know what you're doing. It's too late to stop it now." The message was from the same unknown number. Marisol felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing a game anymore. They were warning her. And this time, they weren't going to let up. Marisol's fingers gripped her phone tightly as the chilling words lingered in her mind. "We know what you're doing. It's too late to stop it now." The message had been sent anonymously, but it felt personal. Whoever was behind it knew exactly what she was up to, and that knowledge sent a shiver down her spine. She had survived Cross, but now she was up against something more dangerous, an unseen force lurking in the shadows, determined to take her down. She stood in her office, the walls closing in as her thoughts raced. The press conference had gone well, but the lingering threat of Eduardo Castillo and the network of corruption he had been a part of still hung over her. And now this message, it was a reminder that her enemies weren't finished with her yet. Her door opened, and Lucy stepped inside, a look of concern etched on her face. "Ms. Delgado, you've received a new report from the investigation team. It's not good." Marisol turned to face her assistant. "What now?" Lucy handed her a thick folder, the weight of it adding to the growing sense of unease in the room. "We've been tracking Eduardo's financial dealings. And we found something disturbing. It looks like he wasn't working alone. There's a trail leading back to multiple high-level contacts, including several prominent individuals tied to Cross. And, Lucy hesitated, her eyes flicking to the folder. There's something else. Someone in our team might be leaking information. Marisol's heart skipped a beat. A leak? In my team? Lucy nodded. We can't identify who it is yet, but they've been feeding Cross's associates inside information. The trail leads to our finance department, but we can't confirm who's involved. If there's a mole within the company, this could be much bigger than we thought. Marisol's mind went blank for a moment as she processed the new information. A leak in her own ranks? She had always trusted her team, but now, it seemed like the enemy was already within her walls, undermining her every move. This can't be a coincidence, Marisol muttered, pacing back and forth. It's all connected. Cross, Eduardo, the corruption in the hotel. And now a mole in my own team? Whoever is behind this wants to see me fall. But I'm not going to let them. She slammed her hand down on the desk. We're going to find the leak. I want a full audit of all our employees, starting with the finance department. I don't care how long it takes. This stops now. Lucy nodded quickly, her face serious. I'll get started on it right away. Marisol stood still for a moment, her mind swirling with the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a battle for control of the royal palace, it was a fight for her life. The people she trusted most were turning on her, and she couldn't trust anyone until she uncovered the truth. The tension in the air was palpable as Marisol glanced out the window, watching the city bustle below her. But it felt distant now, as though she were trapped in her own world of deception and manipulation. The stakes had never been higher. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from her lawyer. She opened it quickly, her pulse quickening as she read. We've received intel. Eduardo Castillo has made a deal with one of your competitors. If we don't act fast, they'll move in on the hotel. Marisol's mind went into overdrive. Eduardo was making deals with her competitors? She should have known that there would be more to his betrayal than just a few false financial records. He was planning to ruin her, to strip everything away. But the bigger question now was, who was behind it all? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Lucy, she called, turning toward the door, contact the security team. I need surveillance set up around the hotel, especially in the finance department. We need to monitor everyone. If anyone's leaking information, I want to know immediately. Lucy hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Understood. Marisol watched as Lucy left the office, her mind now laser-focused on finding the mole. Whoever was behind the leaks would regret crossing her. But just as Lucy stepped out of the door, Marisol's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking. Another anonymous message. It's too late for you, Marisol. We're already in control. A cold chill settled over her. This wasn't just a fight against Cross anymore. Whoever had sent this message was playing a much larger game, one she hadn't fully understood until now. The stakes had been raised higher than ever, and she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. She didn't have time to dwell on it. There was work to be done. She had to stay ahead of her enemies. If she didn't act quickly, everything she had worked for would be torn apart. As the day wore on, Marisol met with her legal team and security personnel, setting up plans to protect her assets and keep the hotel running smoothly. She couldn't let this slip through her fingers. Eduardo's betrayal had only been the beginning. Whoever had been working with him had yet to show their face, but they wouldn't get the chance. At the same time, Marisol was still weighing her options with the media. The press conference had gone well, but the next few days would be crucial. She couldn't afford to let Cross's arrest be the end of the story. She needed to control the narrative, to show the world that she was the one who was in charge. That evening, as the hotel staff began to wind down for the night, Marisol stayed in her office, pacing back and forth. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the walls were closing in around her. It was as if her enemies were everywhere, lurking just out of sight. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't another anonymous message. It was a call from an unknown number. Marisol's instincts told her to answer. Marisol Delgado, she said, her voice steady. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. You're running out of time, Ms. Delgado. The game has already been set in motion. There's no going back. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Marisol's heart raced as she stared at the phone. The threats were no longer subtle. They were clear. And she was running out of time. She set the phone down with a deep sigh, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still blurry. She had a mole to uncover, a competitor to defeat, and now it seemed, an enemy she couldn't even identify. But there was one thing Marisol knew for sure: she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The game was far from over. And this time, she would be the one to dictate the rules. The hours stretched into the night, and Marisol's mind buzzed with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. The phone call had shaken her, the cryptic words echoing in her ears. She wasn't sure who had been behind the voice on the other end, but it didn't matter. It was clear that whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just looking to take her down. They were trying to destroy everything she had built. She stood in her office, staring out at the city lights twinkling below. It was a quiet night in Manhattan, but within her, the storm raged on. Cross may have been locked away, but the bigger threat was still out there. The mole in her company, Eduardo's dealings with competitors, and now the faceless voice that seemed to know everything. It was all starting to feel like a coordinated attack. And she was caught in the middle of it. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an alert from the security team. Surveillance footage shows unusual activity near the finance department. 2 unidentified individuals were seen entering after hours. No clearance. Marisol's pulse quickened. This was it. The leak she'd been hunting. She grabbed her jacket and headed out of her office, her steps purposeful as she made her way to the security room. When she arrived, Rick, the head of security, was already at his post, scanning the monitors. He looked up as she entered. "Ms. Delgado, we've been tracking the activity. The 2 individuals, whoever they are, they've been in and out of the building multiple times this week. They've bypassed security codes and made unauthorized access to the finance department." Marisol's mind raced. Unauthorized access to the finance department? This was serious. She couldn't afford to let these people roam free any longer. Whoever was working against her had resources, they had a plan, and they were moving with precision. "Do we have any identification?" she asked, leaning over his shoulder to get a better view of the footage. Rick shook his head. "They've been careful. Faces obscured, no identifying marks. But their movements are too calculated to be random. They know what they're doing." Marisol's fingers drummed on the edge of the table, her mind working at lightning speed. "How soon can we get them?" "We've already got a few locations flagged where they might be hiding. I've got a team ready to move." Marisol felt the weight of the decision before she spoke. "Get them. Now." Rick nodded. Understood. As Rick turned to coordinate with his team, Marisol felt the pressure mounting. This was it, the moment she would either lose control or gain it back. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but there was no way she was letting these people slip through her fingers. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from the same anonymous number. "You're too late. The deal's already been made. The hotel's assets are being liquidated." Her stomach dropped. A deal? Liquidation? That wasn't just sabotage, it was financial warfare. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. Whoever was behind this was targeting her company's most vulnerable point, its finances. They were making a move on her empire. "Rick," she called, her voice calm but full of authority. "We need to move faster. We're dealing with more than just a mole. Someone's trying to pull everything from under us." Rick nodded grimly as he relayed the message to his team, then turned back to Marisol. "We'll have eyes on the finance department in minutes. But you need to prepare for anything. If they're making a move on your assets, they'll go after the core of your operations." Marisol felt the walls closing in. Cross was only a pawn in this grand scheme. Whoever was pulling the strings had far more power than she could have imagined. The stakes were no longer just about the royal palace. It was everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to build, now at risk. She needed to make sure no one else could make a move on her. And the only way to do that was to confront the heart of the conspiracy head-on. The security team moved quickly, their every step calculated as they moved toward the finance department. Marisol remained behind, her thoughts clouded with the fear of what might happen next. But she didn't have time for fear. She had to act. As the minutes ticked by, Marisol found herself back in her office, staring at the city again, trying to calm her nerves. Her phone buzzed yet again. This time, it was Lucy. She had been in contact with the legal team, but she sounded frantic. Ms. Delgado, it's bad, Lucy said, her voice strained. The lawyers have confirmed it. Someone is in the process of transferring hotel assets to a third party. I don't know who's behind it, but it's happening right now. If we don't stop them, we're going to lose everything. The walls felt like they were closing in. The deal was happening now? Who had the authority to transfer those assets? And how had they managed to pull it off so quickly? I'll be there in a moment, Marisol said, her voice sharp and determined. She hung up and grabbed her coat, moving quickly down the hallway. She was done waiting. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to get away with it. She had come too far to let it slip through her fingers now. When she arrived at the finance department, Rick was waiting at the door. We've got a lead, he said, his voice grim. The individuals from the footage, they're inside. We've got our eyes on them. But we need your authorization to move in. Marisol didn't hesitate. Take them out. And make sure you secure every document related to the assets. No one gets access to those files until we've figured this out. Rick nodded, his team already moving into position. As they entered the department, Marisol's heart raced. She had fought her entire career to get here, to build the royal palace into the shining symbol of her success. And now, it felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She stepped into the room where the officers were securing the individuals. The two men were being held at gunpoint, their faces hidden beneath masks, but Marisol could already tell from their demeanor that they were professionals. As the officers moved to take the men away, Marisol's mind raced. She needed answers. She needed to know who was behind this and what their endgame was. And no matter what it took, she was going to get those answers. Minutes later, as Marisol sat in the interrogation room, she felt her phone vibrate again. Another message. We're already ahead of you, Marisol. Everything is already in motion. You've lost. Marisol clenched her jaw, the finality of the message sinking in like a sharp blade. She had been betrayed, manipulated, and deceived, but she wasn't about to give up. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were burning with fury as she looked at the two captured men. You think you've won? You're wrong. I'm not finished. Not by a long shot. The game had changed, and Marisol wasn't just playing to survive anymore. She was playing to win. The interrogation room felt cold, the silence stretching out as Marisol stared at the two men sitting across from her. They were still wearing the masks, their faces hidden, but their posture betrayed a calm, almost bored demeanor. They didn't seem afraid, perhaps because they knew something she didn't. Marisol clenched her fists, the message on her phone still fresh in her mind. We're already ahead of you, Marisol. Everything is already in motion. You've lost. The words rang in her ears, each syllable dripping with a kind of certainty that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Whoever was behind this wasn't just targeting her, they were out to erase everything she had fought for. She didn't have time to waste with games. Who are you? Marisol asked, her voice ice cold. And who's behind this? The first man, the one sitting to her left, let out a long, slow sigh as if he were humoring her. You think we're going to talk? You think a few threats will get us to spill our secrets? Marisol leaned forward, her gaze intense. You're mistaken. This isn't about threats. This is about survival. And right now, you're in a position where talking is the only thing that will keep you alive. The second man shifted slightly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, but he said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as Marisol's patience wore thin. She wasn't going to waste any more time. Tell me who sent you, and you might live to see another day, she said, her voice low but laced with an authority that could not be ignored. Finally, the first man broke, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about you. You're just the last obstacle in the way. There's no one you can trust, no one you can turn to. It's all over. Marisol's blood ran cold as his words echoed in her mind. Who's behind this? Who's pulling the strings? The man leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You really don't know, do you? Marisol's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain her composure. You'll regret this. Who is behind it? The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of bitterness. You've already met him. You just didn't know it. Marisol's breath hitched, her mind spinning. Him? She had met so many people along this journey. Cross, Eduardo, the employees and associates who had betrayed her, but none of them had given her this sense of dread. The implication was clear. This was someone much more dangerous than anyone she had already dealt with. Before she could press further, the door to the interrogation room swung open. Rick stood there, his expression tight with urgency. "Ms. Delgado, we've got trouble." Marisol stood up instantly, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's happened?" Rick motioned for her to follow him, and Marisol quickly left the room, the two men still silent behind her. As they walked down the hallway, Rick spoke quickly, his words urgent. "We've been monitoring the situation, and there's been a major shift. Someone just transferred a huge amount of funds from your offshore accounts. It's already in motion. If we don't stop it, they'll liquidate everything." Her mind raced as she processed the information. How? Who authorized it? "We're still trying to track it down. The person who authorized the transfer has access to high-level systems, but we haven't identified them yet. All we know is that the transaction was made from within the hotel." Marisol's pulse quickened as the pieces started to come together. A mole. Inside the hotel. Someone we didn't catch. She stopped in her tracks, realization hitting her like a freight train. The last thing she had suspected was that someone from within her own organization could go this far, someone with the power to transfer her assets without leaving a trace. Rick nodded grimly. "We've got a team working on it, but we need you to authorize a full lockdown on all accounts and property." Marisol didn't hesitate. "Do it. Now. And pull every security detail. No one gets in or out. Not until we know who's behind this." As they reached the main security room, Marisol felt the weight of the situation settle over her like a crushing wave. This wasn't just a fight for control of the hotel anymore. This was her empire, the future she had built, being ripped away from her by forces she couldn't see, but could now feel closing in. "We've located the transaction," Rick said as they stood in front of a large monitor, showing detailed records of the transfer. "It came from the finance department, through a high-level account. But the person who approved it," he paused, his eyes widening. "It was Eduardo Castillo." Marisol's stomach twisted in disbelief. Eduardo? How had he managed to get access to those accounts without anyone noticing? And more importantly, what had driven him to betray her so completely? "He's the one who initiated the transfer," Rick continued. "But what's strange is that it's linked to an anonymous account. We don't know who owns it, but it's clear that the money is being funneled out of the country." "Get me everything on that account," Marisol ordered, her voice cold. "And I want Eduardo found. Now." Rick nodded. "We're already on it. But Ms. Delgado, we need to act fast. This could spiral out of control quickly." Marisol's mind raced as she tried to think of her next move. There was no more time to waste. Eduardo had betrayed her completely, but it wasn't just about him anymore. It was the people behind him, the ones who had manipulated him into taking such drastic action. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. There was a mole in her organization. There were assets slipping through her fingers. And there was someone or something out there pulling the strings. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about winning back what was hers. "I'm going to the bank. Prepare everything for me to make the final call. If Eduardo thinks he can destroy me, he's wrong. I'll make sure he regrets every decision he's made." Rick hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. We'll have everything ready for you." As Marisol made her way to the car, a growing sense of determination filled her. She couldn't let anyone take what she had built. Not now, not after everything. She wasn't going to be just another casualty in someone else's game. She had already lost too much to let this be the end. "Get them into interrogation," Marisol ordered. "I want names. I want to know who's behind this, and I want to know everything." The city loomed before her, full of shadows and danger, but she was no longer afraid. Whatever it took, she was going to win. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. The city outside the car window blurred as Marisol stared at the skyline, her mind running through the countless possible outcomes. Everything had come to a head. She had lost trust in her closest allies, and betrayal had taken root inside her organization. But she wouldn't let it break her. Not yet. Not now. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, and no one, not even her closest enemies, was going to take that from her. The car sped through the streets of Manhattan, the weight of her next move pressing down on her chest. She was headed straight to the bank, the place that would decide everything. If she could stop the transfer of her assets, she might be able to regain control, but time was running out. Every minute that passed was another minute her empire was slipping away. When the car finally pulled up outside the sleek, glass-fronted building, Marisol's heart pounded. She stepped out quickly, the cold air biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was 1,000 miles ahead, already envisioning the confrontation that awaited her inside. The security at the bank didn't even blink as she entered. She had a reputation that preceded her. She was a woman used to getting what she wanted. And today, she wasn't going to leave without it. As she entered the elevator, her phone buzzed. It was Rick. "Ms. Delgado, we've found Eduardo," he said, his voice low. "He's trying to leave the city. We've got a team tailing him, but he's not alone. There's someone with him." Marisol's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Rick's voice dropped a notch, sounding more uncertain. "We don't know yet. But it's someone with a lot of power. They're using private transportation, and they've gone off the grid." Her mind raced. Eduardo was the one who had been betraying her, but this new person, this unknown accomplice, was the wild card. This was bigger than just him. Whoever was backing him had their own agenda, and Marisol couldn't let them escape. "Keep tracking them, Rick," she said, her voice firm. "Don't let them get away." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Marisol stepped out into the bank's lavish lobby. She moved swiftly, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The employees at the front desk gave her polite nods, recognizing her instantly. She didn't need an introduction. She made her way toward the back offices, where the most secure accounts were managed. A few employees whispered to each other as she passed, but Marisol didn't acknowledge them. She wasn't here to make friends. Inside the office, a tall man in a suit was waiting for her, the head of the bank. He stood as soon as he saw her, offering a handshake that was professional, yet somehow a little too rehearsed. Marisol barely took his hand before getting straight to the point. "I need to freeze my accounts immediately," she said, her voice sharp. "There's been unauthorized activity, and I need you to stop it. Now." The man's face stiffened, but he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "Of course, Ms. Delgado. I was expecting you." He motioned toward a chair. "Please, take a seat. We've been alerted to some unusual transactions, and we're already looking into it. But you must understand, this process takes time." "I don't have time," Marisol said, her voice unwavering. "You either stop the transactions now, or I'll have you and everyone involved in this removed from the system entirely. I'll make sure you're never in business again." He paused, his eyes flicking to the monitors on the desk, showing the financial records. Marisol could see his hesitation, and it infuriated her. She knew he had the power to stop this. And if he didn't, there would be consequences. "I understand your urgency, Ms. Delgado," he said, his voice strained. "But the transactions have already been processed. It's a large sum of money, and it's already been moved." Marisol's fists clenched. "Then find a way to reverse it. And make sure it doesn't go any further." The man nodded and turned to his computer, typing in a series of commands. Marisol watched as the screen flickered. He was trying to make things right, but she could tell he was being cautious. He wasn't acting with the same sense of urgency she had hoped for. She couldn't afford to wait. As the man worked, she looked out the window, her mind spinning with the realization that this wasn't just about the hotel anymore. It was about her future. Whoever was behind the scenes was playing a long game, and if she didn't act now, they would take it all from her. "Ms. Delgado," the banker finally said, his voice low and apologetic. "I'm afraid it's out of our hands. The transfer has been completed. The funds are already in an offshore account. We can't trace it unless we have permission from the authorities." Marisol felt a flash of panic, but she quickly buried it beneath her determination. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't. "Then I'll get the authorities involved," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not leaving until I know exactly where that money went." The banker sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll have to escalate this to the legal team. But I have to warn you, Ms. Delgado, if this continues, there's nothing I can do to stop it. The people behind this have powerful connections. You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm well aware of the danger," Marisol replied, her eyes narrowing. "Now do your job." She turned on her heel, ready to leave, when her phone buzzed again. It was Rick. "Ms. Delgado, we've got them," Rick said, his voice urgent. "Eduardo and his accomplice. They're in a private jet. They're leaving the country." Marisol's blood ran cold. She knew this was coming. They were trying to escape, to make sure she couldn't reach them in time. "I need that jet grounded," she said, her voice like steel. "Get them before they leave the airspace." Rick hesitated. "It's already too late to stop the plane from taking off, but we have a team tracking them. We'll get them, I promise." Marisol slammed her fist down on the table, frustration and fury boiling inside her. This was the moment of truth. If they got away, if Eduardo and his mysterious ally escaped, everything she had worked for, the royal palace, her legacy, would be lost. She had no choice now. This was the final battle. The fight for everything she had built. "Get them, Rick," she said through clenched teeth. "And do whatever it takes to make sure they don't get away." As she walked out of the bank, her heart pounded with urgency, but also with the conviction that she wasn't going to lose. Not now. Not after everything. She could feel it in her bones. The final showdown was coming, and she would not let them win. Not this time. The next few hours felt like days as Marisol raced against time. The financial systems were still reeling from the stolen funds, but she couldn't wait. Rick's team had managed to track Eduardo's plane, but it was only a matter of time before it would be too late to catch them in the air. She refused to let her enemies slip through her fingers again. Every move she made was deliberate, calculated. This was her final chance to stop them.